Um, so I am, like I said, a minister, but I am today not going to be talking specifically about um, theological issues. I'm not going to be preaching a sermon, but instead we're going to be talking about some of our church history and some of our church present as well, because I want us to be able to look at the ways in which our church has been a player in politics and how we currently are participating in politics, and some hope for me for the future that I think that we can go towards, or that we should be trying to go towards. I think that there are lots of times when Adventists have, kind of forgotten where we've come from. But we're a very young religion, and just religiously speaking, we're not even 200 years old. And so that does make a difference. That context is important. And it's important for us to recognize that all of the things that we went through and where we are now and how we got here. So we're going to do sort of a summary tour of our history. And I understand that we have people who are not here in the United States, and I want to be mindful of that. So this isn't going to singularly be about things that are happening in the United States, because I do recognize that we have a worldwide church and we have a worldwide Sabbath school class that we are all a part of. So we are going to be talking about some things that are happening outside of the U.S., but I do recognize that this is a church that has its roots in things that have happened a lot in the U.S. So one of the things that is a big part of Adventism is the notion of the separation of church and state. And that is a direct result of our being birthed into the United States, and right immediately after the institution of the Constitution of the United States. When we think about it, some of you are older than what the United States was when the church was birthed. So only about 70 years was separating the establishment of the United States and when our church became what it is, an actual organization. So the nation was very, very young at the time, and that really did play a big part in how our church was shaped as well. And the whole idea about separation of church and state is it's not a singularly an American idea, but it's not necessarily an idea that was a long-standing idea. If we're looking at the history of the world, many times church and state were one. And that has been sort of the rule rather than the exception in many cases throughout history. And so it's important for us to kind of look at the different types of church-state unions that there have been over time, because we kind of have a conceptualization of one type of church-state union. And let me just plug in my computer very quickly, so I don't lose any power. But we want to make sure that we're looking at the different types of ways that church-state unions showed up throughout history. So this is not an exhaustive compendium, but these are just a sampling. So there are some national religions that are tied to culture. We see this a lot when we look at the indigenous nations of the Americas, where being a part of that nation meant that you are also born into a religious milieu where you understand things from a very specific religious perspective. So it isn't so much that the nation or the state or the governmental entity that is the ruling power is imposing that religion on you. It's the fact that this is tied to who you are as a person in this community. And in many of these cultures, the idea is that there is an individual ideology that is encouraged for you to understand your place in the world and your place in the community and your place in nature and your place in existence based on what we're doing and teaching through the culture and through our national and community identity. So not so much what we might think of today as a church and a state uniting, but rather it's kind of one and the same. And this is sort of the reason why when we see, the conquistadors and later the colonialists who come to try to change or to civilize various nations, one of the things that they do is to take away their religion, because the idea is that the religion and the culture are one and the same. And so we have to strip both away in order to now make you a blank slate to impose a different identity on you. There's also religions that are regulated by the state. So this is something like when we look at modern Israel. Modern Israel today, if you go there during Sabbath hours, everything is shut down. It is a Jewish state. There is the government. There is going to make sure that all of the institutions of the country are running by the precepts of the religion. You yourself may or may not be someone who is adherent to religion, but you better believe that the things that the government runs are going to be instituting the practices of the religion. We also see this in modern Afghanistan. When we look at various Arab nations where there's Sharia law, the people who are there it's a little bit more that you have to adhere to the tenets of the religion, and the state is taking on the responsibility of making sure that the environment and the country is all running according to the prescribed religious precepts and tenets, whatever that may be, according to the people who are in power, right, at the time. Because obviously not everybody interprets their religious laws in the same way, but whatever the interpretation of the head of state is, you better believe that that will be what's imposed. Then we go a step further. There are some situations where the head of state is the mouthpiece of God. So this is like in ancient Israel, where we had Moses, and then there was Joshua, and then there were the judges, who were themselves people who were giving the commandments of God to the people. So they were the conduit, they were the prophet, they were the judge, they were the one who was giving the instructions to the people to say, this is what you need to be doing, and this is how you do it. And by the declarations of whoever the head of state is, even though Moses and Joshua were not necessarily what we would in our modern day say would be the equivalent of a head of state. Remember, Israel didn't have a king. They wanted a king later on, like the other nations. So their setup was a little bit different. However, there was a leader through which the precepts of God were going through and were telling the people, this is how things need to be. And by their word, judgments or blessings could be established for a particular family. Land was divided according to what they said that God told them, that kind of a thing. The Church of England very similarly had a setup where the head of state is the head of the Church of England. That is still the case today. It's not necessarily taken as seriously as it had been in the Middle Ages, where the authority of the king was exactly whatever everybody was expected to do. Today, it's a lot more lax, but in theory, that is still the case. But this is a situation where the head of state and the mouthpiece of God are one and the same. And then this is the same thing in Vatican City, which is a nation state. Even though we think of the Roman Catholic Church as a religion, it is a religion and a state. The Pope is the head of that. I know that in many minds of Adventists, the Pope is the representation of God on earth, but it's the vicar of God. So it's not the same as being God. I know that sometimes we have taught erroneously that the Catholic Church believes that the Pope is God, but it is a slight difference in saying that the Pope is the vicar of God, so the representation of being the conduit through which God speaks. But that's a whole nother, we can get into a whole other thing about parsing that distinction out. Don't worry about that too much. But then there is those governments and nations that in the past have said that the head of state is God. They are one and the same. So this is ancient Egypt, ancient Japan. Several other nations have this idea that the ruler is the incarnation of God, of divinity, and to defy that person is the equivalent of defying God in human form. And so these are the types of different ways in which church and state have been united in times past. As I talked about before, the conquistadors in the 15th centuries who came to the United States, well, it wasn't the United States at that time, but what would become the United States, decided to convert the indigenous people because they wanted to make sure that those people understood what religion was correct and therefore what kind of civilization was correct, what it was to be civilized, right? In the 17th century, we see the colonizers come who are escaping persecution. They are, or the colonialists who are escaping persecution, and they in turn become persecutors. So they mistreat the indigenous peoples. We're coming up on Thanksgiving here in the United States, and we tell the story from a certain perspective about how the indigenous peoples welcomed those who were coming here and helped them during the first Thanksgiving, making those transitions. But it wasn't all fun and games from the perspectives of the native peoples. And many of them, again, were suppressed by religion. And then not even just the indigenous peoples, but also within the community of the colonies, there was an expectation that you will be someone who adheres to the community religion. And so as we recall, the Salem witch trials were a big deal. That was not the only section of witch trials that there were across the country. There were lots, actually. And so there's this idea that you have to be a certain way. There's this idea that you have to be a certain way in order to make sure that you are in line with the religion. And so even though later on there was this idea that in the 18th century, so 1776, we get the whole establishment of the United States properly. The idea that we're going to have a state that has no religious affiliation. No one can tell you from the government that you have to live this way. You can be free in your religion, kind of. That was the idea. And it's important for us to kind of look at the exact wording of the First Amendment, because I think that sometimes we have a conceptualization of what it says, and it's good to actually read what it says. It says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. There are 4 other freedoms that are part of the First Amendment, but this is the one that we're talking about right now. So the government isn't going to create religion. The government is not saying that you have to have this religion. The government is not going to prohibit you from exercising whatever religion you choose. And that means that you can choose whatever religion you want. So that can be Christian or Muslim or Hindu or Sikh or nothing at all or something totally different. And I think that a lot of people might have a problem with the fact that that is what the First Amendment protects, the idea that anyone and everyone is free to choose whatever religion they desire, and the government cannot impose upon them what they need to do. So this is often misinterpreted, though, as Christians shouldn't have any say in politics. We should be hands off. We shouldn't meddle in that. We shouldn't be a part of that. Christians shouldn't be involved in political issues. So not only should we not have a say in politics, we shouldn't vote for different things, we shouldn't get involved in campaigns, but we also shouldn't be involved in any political issues at all. Because if we get our hands dirty, it's like we're sullying ourselves, or some people believe that is itself a violation of the First Amendment of the U.S. There is this idea that churches shouldn't say anything about the happenings that go on in government, that churches need to remain silent or else they're breaching the First Amendment, which that is not a violation of the First Amendment. I think that people sort of get that confused with IRS codes, which talk about nonprofits, and there's a little confusion about how that impacts churches' nonprofit status, but honestly, it's not what people think most of the time when they say that churches should stay out of things that are happening in government. It's not at all anything to do with what the First Amendment says. The First Amendment says that government shall not establish a religion. It doesn't say that churches cannot speak or have any commentary on government. And then there's another idea that sometimes people have, that pastors can't preach on social issues, because if you do, then that's also a violation. And none of those things are true. And the early Adventist pioneers didn't think that was how we should approach our involvement in the world that we live in either. The early Adventist pioneers understood that we live in a society that is part of a community. And for us to live here, we have to be involved in the things that are happening here. Again, this is not going to be an exhaustive list of all the things that have been written by our early church forefathers and foremothers about politics or voting. This is just a sample. And you'll see that there have been a lot of differences in thoughts and also evolution of thoughts as we go through the years. So Ellen White had been asked about whether or not people should participate in politics or not, should they vote or not. And there were some people who were really pushing this idea that no, Adventists shouldn't vote. Adventists shouldn't be involved because we're preparing for the end of time. We're preparing for God to come again, so we shouldn't be involved in any of those kinds of matters. And so from her perspective, one of the things that she wrote was there are people, men of intemperance, who have been in office today in a flattering manner, expressing their approbation, so their praise of the course of Sabbath keepers not voting. So they're like, yeah, good job, Adventists. You guys aren't voting? That's awesome. And they express their hopes that they will stick the course and, like the Quakers, not cast their votes. So she's saying that these intemperate people, so these people who have no good intentions, are here encouraging Sabbath keepers to just stay silent, don't vote. And she says, Satan and his evil angels are busy at this time. And she calls it the work of Satan for people to tell others that it's good for them not to vote. And she says, and he has workers upon this earth. May Satan be disappointed, is my prayer, is what she kind of sums that up in. So she's like, hey, these people, they are happy when you don't vote. They're happy and they are flattering that when you don't say anything about what they're doing, because for them, you not voting is helping them to continue on in whatever ways they wish to govern or wish to push forward whatever agenda that they have. And so she's saying, hey, I feel like we need to do something instead. And very famously, she talked about specifically the temperance vote. She's like, hey, even if you have to vote on Sabbath, you need to vote because this is an important thing and we can't just allow the government to do whatever it wants to do. James White on the 1860 election said, hey, if a brother chooses to vote, we cannot condemn him, and we want the same liberty if we do not. So James White said, hey, people should be able to choose whatever they want to do. You also see that after this, in 1862, he says, very interestingly, he sort of endorses the idea that Abraham Lincoln was the correct pick for president. He says, those of our people who voted at all in the last presidential election. And so he recognizes that not everybody did. But he said, those of our people who voted at all in the last presidential election, to a man, voted for Abraham Lincoln. We do not know one man among Seventh-day Adventists who has the least sympathy for secession. So here's James White saying, I understand that there are some things that are good and some things that are bad. And there are even some people who should not be a part of governing. And there are some people who are preferable. And he made his desires known and let his opinion be known in the course of talking about politics within the church. And the General Conference in 1865 had a vote on an amendment that said that, in our judgment, the act of voting when exercised in behalf of justice, humanity, and right is in itself blameless, and may be at sometimes highly proper, but that the casting of any vote that shall strengthen the cause of such crimes as intemperance, insurrection, and slavery we regard as highly criminal in the sight of heaven. And so the General Conference even had this debate about whether or not it was important for people to vote on things that were important to us as a church. This, in 1881, was not necessarily voted. It was brought to the floor, and I couldn't find out whether or not it actually passed, but I did see that it was a motion that was made that was stated, and it was subsequently printed in the Review and Herald. And that resolution was, we express our deep interest in the temperance movement, so a very specific thing that is important to Adventism at this time, now going forward in the state, and we instruct all our ministers to use their influence among our churches and with our people at large to induce them to put forth every consistent effort by personal labor and at the ballot box in favor of the prohibitory amendment of the Constitution, which the Friends of Temperance are seeking to secure. So they very clearly had no problem saying that there was an endorsement of a very particular position, and they wanted ministers to even use their influence in that. The debate was about whether or not there should be this statement about the ballot box specifically, because they didn't know if they wanted to tell people that they had to vote or not. And so there was some argument about that part. But the rest of it, from my reading, it seemed that that was not the issue. The idea of using the influence of ministers, the influences of people to secure a certain political outcome that benefited the church was not one that was not a part of the debate or controversy. So out of all of these different discussions over the years, so I've just been showing you just different snapshots of early pioneer thoughts over several decades. Again, this is not all inclusive of everyone's thoughts. There were definitely people who had differing opinions, so it wasn't as if everyone who is Adventist believed this, but it is clear that Adventist church leaders had no problems with people saying that, hey, it's important to be involved in these political actions because these are things that are important to us. And so what we see taking the shape of how Adventists now handle politics, we see that the church becomes one that decides, hey, we should take definitive stands on issues that are directly involved in our church doctrines. So things like temperance were a big deal. And when we talk about the Sabbath, we have developed an entire department that works not only in the United States, but also around the world to help people in the exercise of religious liberty, whatever they may be, and specifically to help people to be able to observe the Sabbath. That's a very big thing that we are making sure that we have a legal team that's available to people. And so there's parole all over our globe, making sure that people are able to get their right to exercise Adventism as they wish. And we are even willing to join forces with other entities to protect church religious liberty. So we have had some very interesting bedfellows when it comes to some of the legal injunctions that we've been involved in, and the amicus briefs that we have signed our names to. We have joined forces with Sikhs and with Roman Catholics, who we often vilify in lots of different ways. We have had unions with various groups and denominations, and even some non-denominational entities, if it serves the purpose of protecting Adventist rights and church doctrine. So we see that very narrowly. We have this idea that it's really important that we will affirm our rights. So what's missing, though, is we don't have a lot of precedent for saying that we'll be involved in human rights. And that comes to a head when we look at the early 20th century. And we have this union of Adventists and the National Socialist German Workers' Party, also known as the Nazi Party. And one of the big things that the church saw as an opportunity was this rise of this very powerful speaker who had a message to tell folks about health and temperance and making sure that they are looking inwards to be good stewards of their body. And they said, wow, this guy, he gets it. He's really aligned with us on all of these issues that are important to us, because the health message is the right arm of the gospel. So we want to make sure that we hitch our wagon to his star, because he is going places with this whole health message thing. And aligning themselves with the Nazi Party gave the church some security and safety within Germany and within Nazi Germany as well. And so you see the church leadership in Germany ingratiating itself to the leadership in the Nazi Party. And so we had several different conference presidents who were in Germany and also in the Central European Division, who were very complimentary of Hitler. And some of the quotes that I pulled, that I just, looking back from the 21st century, looking back at it, it's just like appalling that these are the things that were said, but this was the mentality of the people who were in leadership at the time. So one quote by one of the conference presidents: "Today we will succeed to win over wide circles to a God-ordained lifestyle if we point to the Fuhrer and Reich Chancellor as the example of our people." Because, as you well know, Hitler was a vegetarian. He did not drink alcohol. He made sure that he wanted to promote a healthy lifestyle. But of course, we know what that meant was beyond our health message. It was about purity of the race, right? Adolf Mink, who was also youth director of the German conference, and he later became a conference president, he said, "We are not unprepared for the new order," talking about the Adventist Church. "After all, we have helped prepare the way for it and have helped to bring it about." So the idea that the Adventist Church is actively pushing the same agenda as the Nazi Party. Wilhelm Mueller, who was the secretary of the Central European Division at that time, said, "The Christian rejoices in the fact that his country is in the hands of a man who has his office from the hand of God and who knows himself responsible to him. As anti-alcoholic, non-smoker, and vegetarian, he is closer to our own view of health reform than anybody else." And so the idea that Hitler embodied all of these principles that Adventists held dear made it such that, hey, why don't we support him and support the message that he had? And no one was more of a proponent of this than this woman here. It was interesting to read Hulda Jost. She was involved in the Adventist welfare organization. And one of the things that they wanted to do was to make sure that all of the people who were Adventists not only understood that the alignment of the Nazi Party in terms of health was important, but the alignment of the Nazi Party and their vision for improving the people, the entire population, was important as well. So the improvement of the Volk or the folk of Germany was an important part of this message, this idea that we're helping everyone by boosting up the ideals of the Nazi Party. And in fact, she even quoted Isaiah 58 as part of this idea of we're helping to help people who are oppressed by doing the things that the Nazi Party is suggesting. And so she was a very fervent advocate for the cooperation of Adventism with Nazi propaganda. She not only spread that message in Germany, but she also toured in the United States, where she gave these lectures on health reform and how the Nazi Party and their ideals were something that should be spread even outside of Germany and should be brought to the States. She tried to get an audience with Eleanor Roosevelt. That didn't happen, but she was very successful in doing this tour around the United States, preaching and teaching at churches and also political entities, and helping to spread the propaganda of the Nazi Party within Adventism, even in the U.S. She also encouraged the literature work to be dedicated to printing and distributing Nazi propaganda. I do not speak German. I know that we have several individuals who are a part of our Sabbath school who do, so maybe they'd be able to help me out. Gegen Fargen. I probably totally messed that up, but that was one of the magazines or periodicals that we published in 1943. It talked about the Jews as a foreign body in the blood of Germany. So there was this idea of, the Jews are poisoning the blood of the people who are citizens of that nation. And that's also a line that Hitler writes in Mein Kampf about poisoning the blood of the people and having to rid the foreigners from the population so that they would not poison the blood. And then there was a time actually when the Nazi Party actually turned against several individual churches and denominations because the Nazi Party was not friends with Christianity. And I don't know why the church thought that they were different, but the Christian ideals did not mesh with the Nazi ideals. And so the Nazi Party very quickly decided not only to persecute Jews, but also to persecute religious minorities. So there are several different denominations who were banned under Nazi Germany. And Hulda Jost used her influence and connections as a Nazi propagandist to help reverse the ban on Adventism, and specifically because she had been doing all this work to help the propaganda. Then they were able to say, okay, we'll leave Adventists alone. You'll be able to continue. But what that meant was they were sort of beholden now to the Nazi Party to do everything that they wanted them to do, especially in publishing and distributing Nazi propaganda. So caring for people meant withholding aid to the undeserving. So the best way to help the general population is to make sure that we're only giving aid to those people who are not a drain on society. So that meant that we make a demarcation between who's worthy and who's not worthy of getting aid. And this is something that Adventists, in our Adventist periodicals in Germany, we were promoting because we're now working with the Nazi Party and pushing out this information because they are helping us to push out our information, right? The health reform. So we're one hand is washing the other. We're in a symbiotic relationship here. Aid was discouraged when it came to those with physical or mental disabilities because, again, that is a waste of resources. In order to help the nation, in order to help the Volk, in order to help the Germany as a whole, we need to make some choices. And that means that we're going to help those who are deserving and those who are not. Those people not getting aid is actually beneficial. It's a good thing. And of course, we know that this led later to sterilization of various groups and then ultimately to elimination of people through euthanasia. And so by the time the final solution was employed, Adventists really couldn't say anything because we had so long been perpetuating what was going on. We had been bedfellows with the Nazi Party for such a long time that we could not say anything. And this is not the case for every Christian denomination. Lutherans and Catholics were among those who were resistors, who very vociferously said that this was not right. But Adventists couldn't say that because we were concerned with the preservation of our own organization and how we could still maintain our institution. And that meant cooperating with the powers that be. Excuse me. G.W. Schubert, who eventually became the president of the Central European Union Division, sent a message to one of his colleagues in the General Conference, and he expressed worry at the point where it's way too late, but he eventually expressed worry that, the work of the Lord has ceased. It seems to me as if the government is trying to capture our well-organized colporteur work and using it for the distribution of their own literature, which contains the new ideals of the government with regard to nutrition. So he recognized it, but it was a little bit too little too late because they had been so far gone in their cooperation with what had been happening. And it wasn't necessarily that there was a buy-in of what was going on. There might have been towards the end, but initially the idea of this cooperation was we are only concerned about Adventists and our institution being able to maintain itself and our message getting out and our doctrines getting out. And so we are involved in the government and involved in politics to that end. And whatever else happens, whether it's abuse of human rights, whether it is oppressing people, no matter what else is going on, that part is not our concern. We are singularly concerned only with the things that pertain to the preservation of the Adventist organization as a whole. And so these concerns later on that, now our printing presses are going to be utilized for and conscripted mostly for Nazi propaganda, that's exactly what happened. That's exactly what happened because we had been quiet for too long. And the Nazi Party said, hey, now you owe us, and now we're going to be using all of your resources to spread our message. In 1986, one of our retired conference officials, Fritz Hole, he said, in just reflecting on what happened during that period of time, he said, perhaps since Adventist apocalypticism had so long focused on the enemy in Rome, they may have been blind to the growing menace on the political right. So this idea that they have been so blinded by what is Rome doing. We have this prophecy that Rome is going to be the beast and Rome is going to rise up and is going to unite with the state, and it's going to make this power that we need to defeat and that God is going to have to come in order to defeat and we need to fight against unless we get the mark of the beast, and all of this stuff about Rome, very specifically, that to the detriment of our ability to see anything else, we are only concentrating on Rome. And we don't see how other political powers are doing the exact same thing that we're warning against. And Harold Alomia has a paper that he published in 2010 that gives a brief history of this entire ordeal. And he said in one of his concluding paragraphs that the Adventist Church decided that the best way to serve God was to maintain its organizational structure. In order to maintain the structure, it compromised its principles. And this series of concessions grew out of a malady that could be labeled organizationalism, that has as its main purpose and focus a compulsion to save the organized structure at all costs. It was this urge that drove the church leadership to sell out and ignore the reality of the atrocities that the state was perpetuating under the cloak of national reform. And we see that time and time again, Adventism is only concerned, even today, when we're looking at some of our religious liberty issues. Religious liberty is really, again, as I talked about, very much concerned about what are our doctrines and how can we make sure that our doctrines and our rights to express our religious beliefs and have our free exercise of religion, and that's it. Anything else is not necessarily on our radar. And when we look at the tremendous human rights abuses, not only in the United States, but across the world, the Adventist Church has mostly remained silent. During the Civil Rights Movement in the United States, there was a stark divide along racial lines because there were many Black Adventists who did speak up because they were the subject of a lot of the oppression that was happening. But there were a lot of white Adventists who were just like, we can't really get involved here because civil rights is not it's not a thing that we have to really be concerned with. It's not about a doctrine for us. It's not one of our fundamental beliefs. And so, that's something that we really shouldn't talk about because it's not necessarily germane to our Adventist religion, and being able to just look at our doctrinal beliefs when we're talking about the things that we're going to get involved in, and that doesn't fit the bill. In 2023, there was a Ugandan anti-LGBT bill that prescribed death or life imprisonment for people who were caught being gay, I guess that's the best way I could say, or if the government had a reason to believe that you were gay, they could put you in life imprisonment, or if you were in a same-sex relationship, you could be sentenced to death. And it was not only something that the Adventist Church didn't speak up against, but it was actually supported by the president of the Uganda Union Mission. He went and he signed on behalf of the Adventist Church in support of this bill because in his mind, the Adventist Church as a whole is one that doesn't condone this. And so this is a good thing for the government to impose this sanction on people and to say that, yeah, people can die if they're caught being gay. We see silence in worldwide genocides, and this is all over the world. When we're looking in the Middle East, when we're looking in Africa, when we're looking in Asia, when we're looking at so many different places where there are things that are happening that are oppressing human rights, we stay quiet because that doesn't impact our doctrine, right? So we don't need to be involved in those types of political things, right? Black Lives Matter here in the United States, and it again is one of these issues that jumped across the ocean as well. So we saw many people in various European countries who were also protesting in support of equal rights for Black people and against police brutality, but the church, the General Conference did not say much of anything in support of those rights. Now, the North American Division, to their credit, did have some things to say, and some of our academic institutions here in the United States also lent their voice, but the General Conference as a whole kind of stepped back and was very silent on that. And very germane to what's happening right now, Christian nationalism is also something that we have not seen any vocal opposition by our General Conference about. And I'm going to just kind of give you an overview about Christian nationalism as we kind of wind down a little bit here. So Christian nationalism is something that is not just here in the United States, it's also in various European countries. I've seen and heard of political movements that are very much trying to get back to this idea of establishing religion because different governments have been too secular. And that sounds like a good thing, right? Because after all, the Adventist Church was birthed out of the Second Great Awakening in the middle of the 19th century. This idea that, people have become too secular and we need to get back to the basics of the Bible. And so it's important for us to be able to make sure that those principles are being taught and established so that people can know the Lord. Isn't that what we want to do? We want to witness and have people know who God is. But the part of that we kind of miss is that when you are establishing your religion, you're oppressing someone else's religion, and the religion that gets established might just oppress you in ways that you least expected. And Christian nationalism isn't just about, at least here in the United States, it's not just about Christianity and religion, but it's very much fueled by white supremacy, and a very specific type of white supremacy where there are roles that are particular for women that value their ability to be wives and to bear children, and that is their inherent and intrinsic value. If they're not people who bear children, then they are less valued in society. We want to have male headship in the home. We want to make sure that women are doing what the men in their lives are telling them to because they are the protectors. And we want to establish this because that's the rule of law established in the Bible. And we're just looking to go back to traditional biblical values, right? We want to make sure that we are doing those things to help support the values, the family values that are found in the Bible. And there are other people who do not share our values. And so if you are somebody who is a foreigner and you are somebody who is immigrating from another place and you're coming here and you're bringing your other values that are not Christian, they're not Protestant, they're not specifically our idea of these patriarchal roles of the Bible, then you know what? You are someone who's poisoning the blood of our country. And we have had a politician who has used those exact words in talking about these kinds of ideas. So Christian nationalism is directly opposed to the First Amendment that says that the government shall not establish any religion. And there have been elements that have already been enacted in multiple states here in the United States. Again, I understand that this is not just a United States focused forum. However, I think that because Adventism is a religion that was birthed here, we do have to look at how these things are influencing us, because we want to pretend as if our environment is not influencing our decisions as a church, but it really does. Culture influences the way that we practice, no matter what your religion is. It colors the lens with which you read the Bible, with you interpret the Bible, and you apply biblical principles. And we have seen that different states have taken the ideas of Christian nationalism and said we need to make sure that our children in public schools learn these principles. So now we're going to make sure that the Ten Commandments are posted, and they are mandatory to be posted inside of our public schools. And students need to be taught in every classroom the importance of the Ten Commandments. And there are people who are saying, well, that's great. Why not? That seems like it should be a good thing. We should return to the Bible, put the Bible back in school. But as you and I both know, the things that other people believe might not be what we believe. And so whose version of the Bible, even just the Ten Commandments, what version of the Ten Commandments is going to be taught? And what is going to be said about those commandments? Particularly when we talk about the fourth commandment. Is that going to be taught the way that we teach it? Probably not. And so this idea that, hey, this is a good thing is only good when it aligns with what you believe, right? Christian nationalism is also supported in Project 2025. I want to just briefly talk about that. Project 2025, a lot of people have made a lot of hay about it. And it is a real document. It's not fake. You can look it up. I can show you the links, I can share those in the chat later on if anybody wishes to check it out and read it for themselves. It's almost 1,000 pages. But I committed myself to making sure that I'm not just listening to what other people say, that I'm reading and looking for myself and reading the things that are in it. And it's scary. From page one, it's scary. And it is published by the Heritage Foundation, which is an extreme right foundation that has been publishing these documents since the 1980s. So people talk about Project 2025 as if this is new. This is not new. It is the latest version of something that has been published for the past 40 years called the Mandate for Leadership. And the Heritage Foundation publishes this in the hopes of giving it to the conservative party so that if their candidate wins, they'll be able to enact certain things from the Mandate for Leadership. This has been really talked about in the news and in social media because this is the first time that it was blatantly put out online for the public to see. And part of the reason why it was published was because they wanted to recruit people. And it says so in the very first introduction that the idea is to recruit people who want to be part of the administration to enact this. Because also part of Project 2025 is the idea of introducing what's called Schedule F, which gets rid of career federal employees and allows whoever the president is to simply appoint people into those positions. So you too, if you want to be someone who is part of this administration to push forward the mandates that are in this document, you can go through our academy and you can learn about what to do so that you can be a part of the next administration to implement these things. And so the Heritage Foundation published this. They have a little academy that's going on to help prepare people to be a part of it. 3/4 of the last Mandate for Leadership that was in 2017 got implemented by the Trump administration. And the Heritage Foundation has blatantly on their website all of the different things that were in the last Mandate for Leadership, how they were enacted or passed in 2017, and the dates that they were passed. And so it isn't something that is being spread by anybody but the people who are doing it themselves. The Heritage Foundation themselves are saying that, yeah, we 100% have had our hand in this, and thankfully we've gotten a lot of our propositions passed. Authors of it are people who are from the Trump administration, including Ben Carson. There is a list of authors at the very beginning. Out of all the authors, I believe I counted, there are only about 10 who were not explicitly said to have been part of the Trump administration. And so I know a lot of people are like, oh, but this isn't President Trump's thing. But it's kind of a little Wizard of Oz-ish, if you ask me. Don't pay any attention to the person behind the curtain, because if you're saying that everybody who is in his administration is a writer or an editor or an instructor at the Project 2025 Academy, and then you're saying he has nothing to do with it, that doesn't pass the smell test. And his vice presidential candidate, or running mate rather, wrote the foreword to the text that the president of the Heritage Foundation has written, and that book actually, once that was found out, the publishers postponed publishing it but you can still see it on Amazon and find it on Amazon to pre-order. So the idea that they're not intertwined or don't have anything to do with the GOP candidate is that's stretching credibility to me. But Christian nationalism, and specifically Project 2025, was something that Liberty Magazine, to their credit, gave warnings about, specifically with regards to the Sabbath issues that were embedded in there, that talked about establishing a day of rest on Sunday. And so Liberty Magazine did have something to say about the fact that this was in this documentation, and it was something that Adventists should be aware of and should actively fight against. But again, this is an issue that is specifically just about how it pertains to Adventist doctrines, right? There's a lot of other stuff in Project 2025 that is oppressive to people who are of minoritized backgrounds, to women, to various other groups, but we don't really talk about that because that's not our doctrine, right? And Danny Shelton from 3ABN fame has declared himself on air as a Christian nationalist, which I thought was interesting I thought to myself, does he not know what Christian nationalism is and he's just saying it out of ignorance, or is he saying it in full knowledge of what it is and doesn't care if people know that this is how he affiliates himself? So I don't know Danny Shelton personally, so I can't ask him whether or not he really understands the power of his words when he very proudly said, I am a Christian nationalist. That really was shocking to me. And so I would be very interested in trying to figure out whether or not this is something that he doesn't understand the implications of what Christian nationalism is. So just closing, I hope that we will stop just being so preoccupied with Roman Catholic Church that we miss like these different issues that are going on and being perpetrated and being instituted by various other sources outside of the Roman Catholic Church, because teaching the Bible in public schools, making sure that there's 10 Commandments in classrooms, these are things that we should be vociferously fighting against. Like this, there's no question. If we are looking at our prophecy in the face of the idea that we know that there's going to be a time when government is going to try to impose religion, this is it. This is what's it's happening as we're speaking. So why isn't the church speaking? So we need to make sure that we're looking at what's going on and giving a voice to those things. We also can't get caught up in tropes of heroes and monsters. I talked about Trump, and I know that for some people on here, I am under no delusion that everybody here is, of one political persuasion or the other. I just laid out the facts as it is with his affiliation with this particular agenda. And I know that some people that's going to rub the wrong way. And I think that especially when we look in light of where we were in the past and what the potential dangers are in the future, you might say, we can't really compare people to, Nazi Germany and all those things. Like that won't ever happen again. That can't ever happen again. That's not something that's going to happen in the future. So we shouldn't really bring up those things in the past. But obviously we know that, if those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it, right? And we also need to make sure that we're not looking at this as a lens of starkly good people and starkly bad people. Everyone is a mix of everything. When we look at people like Martin Luther King, there's a lot of people who venerate him as a hero, and he absolutely was obviously a hero in the sense of making sure that he was a proponent for civil rights. He was out leading it to the point where he was killed for his staunch beliefs, for his unwavering voice against human rights abuses. And we sometimes venerate people like Dr. King and say, oh, no one could ever touch him. Everyone is always subjected to being less than that. And so there could never be another Dr. King. Yeah, there could be. There could be somebody else who rises to that occasion. And at the same time, on the opposite side, people make this mythology of like Hitler, that he was this monster. He was this one of a kind, never to be duplicated evil. But he was just a guy. He was a guy who had an idea, who had discriminatory beliefs about certain people, who had an ideology that he successfully stole to others, and who was voted into office by people who bought into that ideology, and who was helped by people who felt that his ideology was beneficial to their worldview. And so it's not that he was some superhuman person and the things that he did could never be done by anyone else. It was the fact that people were complacent and didn't recognize the danger in the things that he was saying and were willing to actually assist him in getting his agenda through because they felt that the things in which they aligned were so much more important than all the other things that he was doing that oppressed people. And so they were willing to turn a blind eye to those things because they were upholding the parts of the ideology that they felt they could cooperate with him on. And that's how he not only rose to power, but sustained power for such a long time. And people were willing to be a part of that. And our church was a part of that. And the last thing that I hope that we understand is that we cannot be merely concerned with institutional preservation. Our idea about how we communicate with others in the world, how we are part of the communities that we live in, not just here in the United States, but all over, cannot just be to the benefit of the Adventist Church institution. It can't just be about whether or not our fundamental beliefs are being preserved, whether or not the things that we believe are being put forth. When we see people who are truly being oppressed, we need to speak up against that because we are first, before we are Adventists, we are people of God. And God asks us to help those who are oppressed. God says, how can we say that we love the Lord, but we hate our brother or sister who we see here on earth, right? So if we are people of God, then we need to make sure that we're doing what we can to help further the liberation of other brothers and sisters of ours here on earth. And so I hope that we're not just looking at politics through a lens of partisanship, or whether you are part of this party or another party, because it doesn't matter what party is doing it. If we see something that is abusing others, that is denigrating others, that is oppressing others, that is making other groups inferior and some others superior, we need to say that that is not in alignment with our beliefs. Whether or not those people who are being denigrated are people who align themselves with us, just by the fact that we are people of God, we should be standing up and speaking out for that. So our advocacy work has to be much more expansive than just whether or not our beliefs and our ability to exercise our religion is being preserved. So that is my time. I think that I'm right at an hour, and so I'm going to stop my sharing there. And I guess I saw some hands that were coming up, and I guess Dr. Lofthouse, it's for you.
Yes, you did see some hands raised, and I thank you for a most thorough and I think fairly inclusive history of this movement. I think what it all comes down to is, what does it mean for me? That's going to be our discussion point today. I just finished reading a fascinating book that is extremely relevant to the era of Hitler and the Nazi rise. It's called In the Garden of Beasts by Eric Larson, he writes these historical collections of evidence and documents and makes it personal. This book is fascinating with regards to how Hitler's regime was felt by good people. And it comes about because the U.S. Ambassador Dodd had a daughter named Martha. She was 24 when they moved to Berlin. And her writings, letters, and attitudes convey very poignantly how you could support what Germany was going through at that time, and are very illustrative of how we need to be careful about whom we align ourselves. Mm-hmm. So, Timo, you were the first one to have your hand up. I'm interested in your perspective as a person from one of those now neutral countries, right? Or is NATO still on your agenda? Timo, share with us. Please unmute and let's hear what you have to say. You're still muted.
There
There you go. You're on.
No, I think I didn't have any question. It was a mistake, I think. Sorry.
We appreciate you being here. Stay tuned. You may have something else to add in the future. Horace, your hand was up next. Please unmute. Horace Alexander.
Thank you, Dr. Ray, for that rather comprehensive overview of our involvement with politics or lack of involvement with politics. One of the striking points of your presentation was the fact that there are such strong parallels between the church's complicity with Nazi Germany and today's complicity with the evangelical movement with the Trump movement as well, with MAGA. I find that rather interesting and very instructive. But, you know, I hear statements, I remind myself of statements like, all it takes for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. And that there are sins of commission and sins of omission. And now I'm wondering, to what extent did the Bible, particularly Romans 13, contribute to the complicity of Adventism or the evangelicals today with what I perceive to be movements that are definitely inhumanitarian, definitely unchristian, but essentially evil? I mean, I'm referring to Romans 13 verses 1 all the way through to 8, but I will just read the first couple of verses to remind people. Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Whomsoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God, and they that resist shall receive to themselves damnation. I'm having a hard time as a conscientious, socially aware Christian to reconcile my view of civil rights and other human rights. I'm having a hard time reconciling what I do with what I read in Romans 13. Can you help me? Yes.
Sure. So I'm going on to my Bible right now. So looking at just the context of it, where Paul is in Rome or writing to the Christians in Rome, he's asking them to make sure that they are not causing issues with the government in terms of Christianity. So remember, all of it, we have to remember the context and the culture of what all of these letters are written in. And so you have a very nascent religion. So Christians are still at this time maybe considered an offshoot of Judaism. They're not quite liked by the Jews. The Romans definitely don't like them. People don't know how to categorize them. And so his idea is it's important for you to make sure that you are not doing anything that causes reproach on the name of the movement, the way as it was at this time. And so just reading a little bit more, he says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except for God, and they that exist have been instituted by God. But it doesn't stop there. He says, whoever resists the authority resists what God has appointed, and those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not terror to good conduct, but to bad. So he's saying rulers aren't a terror or a threat if you're doing something good, but if you're doing something bad, then you should be fearful. It says, would you have no fear for the one who's in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive approval, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does bear the sword in vain. Does not bear the sword in vain, for he's the servant of God, and the avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but for the sake of conscience. For because of you, you also pay taxes, for the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes, whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. So this idea of we need to give back. Remember when Peter and Jesus had this discussion about render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. pay those taxes that you're supposed to pay to Caesar. Give honor to those who are in authority over you. Don't make trouble. But just as he says, children, be subject to your parents as to the Lord, it's the same concept of be subject to authorities if they are doing what God is telling them to do. That doesn't mean you cave to evil authorities. We don't do what the Nazis often use an excuse. I was just following orders. I was just doing what I was told. It wasn't me. It was the people above me. I was just going along with it. Just following orders does not absolve you of your Christian responsibility. So if God is asking you to do something, there's a higher authority than the one who is in power at that time. Because remember, slavery at one time was legal as well, right? And
that's right.
And the Quakers, who are an exceptionally devout religious sect, were among the chief people who helped to institute the Underground Railroad to help the slaves. And so it's their history as much as Black history in working in tandem to say we have to subvert the authorities when they're doing things that are unjust. And so I think that especially those of us who live in democracies, we have the power to say that we are going to directly use our voice to make sure that those things that are unjust do not continue to take root and take hold. So we have the ability to speak up and to use our citizenship and to use the power that's invested in us by our different constitutions and governments to say that we're going to do those things and fight against powers that are not of God and that are oppressing people and doing things that are unjust. And so just because someone has made it into power doesn't necessarily mean that we need to be silent and just subject ourselves to them and not do anything that will rock the boat if what they're doing is not of God. So God is the ultimate authority over all of the other things that are happening. But we don't cause trouble just to cause trouble, but we make a name for God in doing the right thing and making sure that we're always putting forth the name of God in a way that doesn't bring reproach to God. So I think that is much more in line with what Paul is telling the Romans, rather than saying just blindly follow whatever the authorities are telling you to do. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, that addresses it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ray. I think that the image of God and our assistance in preserving or warping that is extremely important. Thank you for raising that issue. Linda.
Hi, thank you, Doctor, for your presentation. I appreciated it. I may be coming from a little different perspective. I won't be voting for Trump. Didn't vote for him in 2016 because I didn't like his policies. But neither will I be voting for Kamala Harris, Vice President. I am one person, but I'm thankful for the Constitution that one person can have a view, because I can have flack. I've gotten flack from the right, but I've also gotten a lot of flack from the left. In my small town that I live in, I would have to go through a whole bunch of hoops to put up a big protest sign that says I'm uncommitted. Because unless the Biden administration can stop it to Netanyahu and his war cabinet of genociding these people through starvation in Palestine and Gaza, I cannot vote, because Harris has joined herself at the hip with Biden. And I've gotten pushback that, she can't speak freely now because she's the vice president. But she's not even making overtures that I've heard. Maybe I haven't heard all of them. And I cannot, in good conscience, vote for her. While I look at the news through this free speech, and they get out a lot of images that are not portrayed on CNN and MSNBC and some of your major. They put out a little bit of it, And the last one that I saw was of this young boy who was turned 20 this week and was burned alive by the IDF, Israel's military. They tell them to go one place and then they bomb the place. I cannot. Either I will vote undecided or I will not vote for the president at all. But I cannot, in good cut. I like her policies as far as domestic. She's going to do a lot for the community, the middle class. But I couldn't look myself in the mirror and vote for Kamala Harris. Thank you for letting me share my views.
No, thank you so much, Linda. I know, I mean, this isn't like a political campaign call, so I'm not going to get into all of that. But I do know several people who feel the same way, and I personally understand exactly what you mean in terms of looking at the atrocities and seeing what's going on and understanding that there's this issue that hasn't been addressed in terms of how people are being treated in just human rights abuses. And so for me, personally, I understand that there is never going to be a candidate that I am 100% with. And in my view, I have to look at what candidate is most in line with the views that I see are important. And in terms of Gaza in particular, I think that one candidate is going to be more fair in terms of that situation than another candidate is. And so they might not be implementing the same things that I would do, because I know in my own mind, if I were president, I bet I would do this and that. From what I've heard from people who have been president in their memoirs and things like that, they have ideas about what they're going to do. And then when they get into office, they understand that it's not that easy. So I have to trust that because I've never been in that seat. So even if what they might do is not exactly what I would do, I feel like there is one candidate who I think would be a proponent of continuing human rights abuses and another candidate who would not. And so that's kind of how I am viewing it. But I do understand what you're saying, and I do respect your view.
Thank you, Linda. George, tune in.
Well, thank you. You can hear me well, right?
Absolutely.
Yes. Thank you for your presentation, Doctor. I really appreciate it. And thank you, A Today, for promoting it, because we have several concerns here in this country now. I think I will make an appointment in your office for a session of reduction of anxiety. Being myself a psychologist, I know the value of sessions like that. And why anxiety? Well, very quickly, my parents went through 2 wars. They were victims of Nazi Germany and then communism in Czechoslovakia, where my family is from. I was born after the war, later on in France. And then, so I have some background understanding the problems with fascism and nationalism. And then, 35 years ago, I made it to America after being in Brazil for 40 years. And finally, we made it to America, the land of the free, and where we are protected. And look at this now. So you probably can see why my level of anxiety is a little bit higher, and it will be still higher in the next 2 weeks and a half. Because at this point in America, we are not dealing with the economy, immigration. All those are secondary. I wish people could understand that you are dealing with the dichotomy, democracy, fascism. And I cannot understand, and help you to understand it if you can, because I don't think there's an answer for that. How come that half of the country, or the voters at least, are saying clearly, I won't be under a government, a fascist government. I want a dictator taking charge of my country and all that. This is so frustrating for someone who is an immigrant, who is an American citizen like me, and having to deal with something like this. How come America is so sick right now? They cannot see the difference between fascism and democracy. For those who are saying that they're not going to vote, well, thank you very much. You're opening the door still wider for fascism, and one day you might be repenting from what you are doing. So I just wanted to share this and as a kind of testimony about this issue. Thank you so much again.
Thank you for sharing that very personal experiences and your family's experiences. I think that's a perspective that, as somebody who has lived through some of these things that have happened in history, knowing how these things happen and come about is really important to recognize. And I hope that people hear you and people are listening to what you're saying.
They won't. That's the problem. They are not listening to what Trump is promising to do in their life, and they're just messing up with fire. It's gonna burn them badly very soon if he wins. I still hope he doesn't.
I think that one of the things that is, like at the end, I talked about Danny Shelton. And I don't know, again, what he meant by, he is a Christian nationalist. But I think that people who subscribe to Christian nationalism, especially openly like that, they may be looking at the fact that, hey, I'm a Christian, and, this idea of Christian nationalism is in line with values that I hold because I'm Christian and they want to establish Christianity, so that's a good thing. And so I think that people are kind of looking specifically at that, the idea that something that they're holding on to, this idea that there's something that I like, that I believe in, that's shared. So that's what I'm going to vote for, and not any of the other things. Kind of like how the Adventist Church did, in the 1930s, saying, we like this health message, so let's hold on to that and kind of ignore all the other things that are going on. That's the only thing that I can think of that really has some kind of logical consistency.
I really appreciate all this discussion here because it's such a crucial moment for this country that we have so much hope for and being in the country. I'm retired now, but it's amazing. I cannot understand people choosing deliberately a fascist government. How can that be after so many stories and so many lessons in recent history, and still people don't get it? What would make them not to get it? But I talk too much. Yeah, already. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, George. You don't talk too much. You think too much. I appreciate that.
Maybe I know too much about this issue. That's the problem.
Ed Zerkwitz, where are you at?
Yeah, I live in Canada, and I appreciate some of the key issues that were brought up by the presenter. And but what I want to address here is the idea that the Adventist world, 10% of, or whatever percent of the Adventist population lives in the United States. But what about the rest of the world? Most of this presentation seems, and chats, certainly, most of the chats were focused on what's happening in the United States. I appreciate you brought up the deplorable support of Hitler, which is elsewhere in the world. But it seems like everything else seemed to be focused, your presentation and the discussion primarily, on the United States and the shortcomings of, liberty, like slavery, got finally abolished, and the fear of Project 25 taking place. I've sort of glanced at Project 2025, and it's 900 pages, and sure, if a lot of that got implemented, there'd be a huge concern about political bias and separation of church and state and so forth. But my question really is, what about the rest of the world, the Adventist world at least?
Oh, absolutely. So I did focus a lot on Adventism here in the United States, as I mentioned, because we are coming up to a political election right in the next 2 weeks. And because our World Church headquarters is here. And so a lot of the things that happen here do influence how the World Church operates and how it moves. But as I did talk about a little bit briefly, is that there are other things and other places where we need to be very vocal. So I mentioned genocides that are going on that we need to be talking about, and that I have not heard anything from the General Conference about. I mentioned Uganda and the laws there that are against the LGBTQ community, and how we have actively had leadership who is willing to sign their name on things like that. And so when we're looking at, and I don't know if there's any specific human rights abuses that are going on in Canada, I have to admit that we don't get a lot of news from our neighbors up north. So I'm not very aware of anything that's happening in Canada. If there is, please do let me know. But I do feel like our church has been very silent about a lot of things that is, if they don't pertain to our doctrinal views, we are very reluctant, if at all, to say anything about any of those issues. And I think that we should. I think that if we have a world church, our world church should be vocal about making sure that abuses that are happening have a voice speaking against them that comes from the Adventist Church, that we're saying specifically that these things can't happen. And I think that sometimes we have been silent in many ways, where we need to be speaking up. And so getting information about what's happening in other places around the world, I think, is really important. And letting your voice as an individual in other places around the world be known, so that we recognize what's going on. And even if our World Church headquarters isn't saying those things, we as individual Adventists should be speaking with a voice to saying that human rights abuses are not okay.
Okay, thank you. Yes, there are some human rights abuses in Canada, of course, but not on a large scale, like, for example, what took place in other countries like Germany and Uganda, United States, and so forth. I have a follow-up question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
And that is, in your response to me, or maybe it's very real, the suggestion is being made that a lot of influence on the GC comes from the United States. And to some degree, of course, that will be true. But to what extent? Because I find that kind of alarming to think that a lot of influence on the GC is coming from the United States,
It is alarming. It is alarming. You're not wrong about that. I absolutely agree. I think that the United States does have a very outsized influence on the GC, particularly because the headquarters are here, but also because many of our presidents, we have had some presidents from Europe, but we specifically are very much still dominated in a lot of thought by the United States. I know a part of that, I've gone to the past, I didn't go to 2020 GC because that was closed, but I've gone to the past 5 GCs before that, and the idea that the United States outsized influence has been a perpetual issue in the world church, and the idea that the monetary influence as well is part of what drives that. And so there was a plan that was worked out a few years ago that the apportionment of funding from the General Conference from the North American Division was going to be tapered off, so that there was sort of more equity in terms of giving And also, there was supposed to be an intentional ramping up of individual representation from different places around the world as well. Whether or not that has happened, I don't know. Like I said, I didn't go to the 2020 GC to be present in the proceedings, and COVID just had everybody sort of discombobulated. So I don't even know how well those plans are progressing, but I know that there was sort of this titration plan in terms of giving and versus influence. And so it really should be a lot more balanced, because you're right. There is an outsized influence in the United States on what happens in the GC.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you for bringing that up and bringing it home. Ray Stovall, what has Bobby been putting in your ear? Let's hear about it.
An interesting subject we have here today. First off, we listened to the Question Time program on the BBC, and leading up to the last election over there, their issues were very, very much like ours, except for the religious aspect. However, I think, to me, it seems like in this country, or amongst Adventists or conservative Christians, you're basically talking about one focus most of the time. We really haven't been taught or learned to think outside the box. So on issues when it comes to politics, we seem to gravitate towards one or two items instead of looking at the broad picture. We don't have freedom as we normally think of it. Our church is a box. You're free to move around inside that box, but not outside the box. You're an SDA if you're in the box. And that's not freedom. Not in the moral sense or the attitudes or how we think or act. So when you bring in politics like we have going on now, to me it's very easy to see why people will say character matters, but character doesn't matter, because if you listen to all the rhetoric, they say, well, don't worry about the character. What are they going to do? We have disassociated character with who or what the person is. We can't say ignore the character, because that's not real important, and just call, oh, that's just personality. We're too focused on one or two things. When you brought up Liberty Magazine was going after that one issue of the Sabbath, it was like, did they read anything else? That's why I made the comment, Lord, we kept the Sabbath. We did everything we could to make everybody could keep the Sabbath. And he's going to look at it and say, what? What about all those other things? See, we focus too much on one thing. We're not a broad-minded people. And so being Adventist hinders us in many ways from broad thinking. So when we look at the world of politics and everything, we get too narrowly focused. There's big pictures. Yes, people may say, I'm against this person because they're supporting Israel, or I'm for this person because they're supporting the other side. We live in a world that's huge. Politics around the world is complicated. It isn't just about one single issue. You have a whole world that's trying to get along together and not doing a very good job. But you got to focus on more than just one or two things on what you're going to do. And it's the same thing in life. If you're worried about the Sabbath, you got a very narrow view on how you can operate in this world. I can't have this job. I can't have that. I don't understand it. Free the mind, people. Free. I mean, I was raised in the Adventist Church and lived in many holy cities. And so I know what that mindset is. And it's once you got out of it, you begin to enjoy real freedom of thought and idea and understand what it means for other people to really truly have their freedom. Anyway, that's my spiel.
That's a good spiel. Courtney, what do you think?
No, I appreciate your thoughts, and I thank you for sharing an idea that, yeah, we have to, and you actually used the phrase that one of the individuals that I had quoted about his reflections on Nazi Germany, he used that same phrase. I believe that Adventists at the time had too narrow of a view of the world, and that was why some of the things happened that they allow. The idea that we get very laser focused on one thing or two things and don't kind of look at the big picture is really something that allows evil to perpetuate. And I don't have a problem with saying it is evil when we have people being abused around the world, or it is evil when we have minimization of people with disabilities, or we try to oppress those who are coming from minoritized backgrounds, or we're trying to kill people who are LGBTQIA. That, those kinds of things, I don't think that anybody should have a problem with saying this is wrong. Even if you are a person who is very staunchly affixed to your beliefs in terms of what you have defined as your religious faith, I think that when it comes to people saying, I'm going to kill you because you don't believe or practice or live the way that I think you should, I think that that should be something that all Adventists should say, that's not okay. I don't think that that should be a controversial thing. And if we are living in a society where we say and we profess that we are Christian, I think that that's the minimum, the bare minimum of what we should be able to say, that we're willing to take a stand on, and to look beyond just our narrow view of the world and say there are people who live in lots of different ways. And for me to be free, other people need to be free to live how they want to as well, without fear of reprisal or fear of persecution or fear of death if they don't subscribe to what I subscribe to. So thank you so much for your response, Ray.
Yeah. Can we support justice no matter what it looks like? That's tough. Randy, I'm delighted to see you ready to contribute. How does this affect you, and what are your thoughts today?
Well, so I'm going to ask everybody a question, and you can put your answers in the comments. Thinking about the late 1920s, the early 1930s in Germany, and those of Jewish heritage and Eastern Europe, largely as Eastern Europe fell, those Jewish people who managed to get out made their way to safe havens. What was the catalyst for them? What were the signs that they saw? When did they see them that motivated them to, if they had the means, to flee? And then, how did they choose where to flee? Kind of a personal question, I guess, but that's really kind of where I'm at. And I've been thinking about this question for the last few years, honestly. People who don't grasp the potential gravity for certain parts of our, quote, community, based on the outcomes, just don't get it. I guess that's where I'm at today.
I think I hear you, because the idea that how do you know when the time is now. I got to get out of here. And where do I go to? I think that is a real question. I think that there are lots of people who, like you said, had the means. I think that there were people who saw the signs early and recognized that was not going to go well. And they had people who were willing and able to help them to go someplace where they were able to, as you said, find a safe haven. Einstein was able to flee because of his contributions to physics. He was able to find a safe haven. There were other people who, because of their contributions to society as either artists or scientists or other kinds of professionals, were able to get sponsorship to the United States and to other countries that they felt were kind of safer. And it is hard for people who don't have those means to be able to, number one, have a place to go, and number two, get there, even if they do see the signs. And I think that when you are part of a minoritized group, you recognize how tenuous your position is at any given moment. And that's very difficult for people who are not marginalized and not minoritized to really understand how much mental energy it takes to continually think about those things. It is a luxury to be able to not have to think about if this goes this way in this election, or if this goes this way with this vote, or this goes this way with this policy, I'm still going to be okay. There are individuals who have the luxury of saying, I'm not going to care or be involved because it doesn't impact me or affect me. But as you were saying, for many of us, those things are very real, and those conversations about what do I do if XYZ happens is a very real, it's not like a theoretical conversation, it's a real conversation that you have to have an internal dialogue with, or even a external dialogue with other people who care about you, and try to say, hey, I got to make some friends someplace else if I need to go. So I don't know how to answer that question, but I definitely do think about that even myself.
It's a real question.
Yes.
It's a real question for a lot of people in our country. And if you're unwilling to acknowledge it, you're part of the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I'll leave it there.
Yeah. I think that for those of us who think and feel with you, Randy, injustice is being done, even in my church. And I'm struck by what you said, Dr. Ray, just moments ago, about how similar it feels to sit in an Adventist pew and recognize that there are things about my church of which I'm not proud. Do I stay there and try to speak? Do I leave? It's not so much life and death as it may have been for some in your illustration, but it is just that for many people who are being unjustly distinguished.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Kevin James, thank you. You've been commenting on our chat. I'd love to hear your thoughts in a question or comment now.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Ray, thank you for a great presentation. There was so much said in that, of which a history I'm very interested in myself. I'm the Associate Director for Religious Liberty at the Southern Union presently. And this topic has been very profound for me for the last 30 years. So I've been doing a lot of study of the Nazi problems in 1930 and whatnot. And just a couple of comments, maybe to broaden what you had shared. And you shared so well. And it's not to say that it was too narrow. I think you covered a lot. But one of the things I think is to look at our history as Adventists is that politics was seen as participating in Babylon early on, before we became a denomination. In fact, it's a miracle that we became a denomination, because there were many people who felt that if we legalized our denomination, we would be a part of that very Babylon that they felt that they needed to resist against. So voting was seen through the prism of engagement with Babylon. And so it was a very unpopular thing for a long time. And I think we're suffering from that history, from that genetics that we've had all these years. There were a few times where Ellen White did speak out against the, um, help me out here, where the slaves were being brought back. I forgot the name of the, oh, anyway, we were to resist against the law that was bringing the slaves back to the South when they went up to the North. Fugitive Slave Act. Thank you. And so I think that's something to keep in mind, is that this is in our genetics and we're having a problem with this. I think also what tends to happen too with organizations, and especially I think in the times of Germany, has to do with the protection of the organization. They were looking for ways to protect the organization and keep it in place while all that was going on. At the same time, I think we had a number of German members who probably thought along the same lines over that decade and a half since World War I, of all the issues that happened with Germany under the Versailles Agreement. I think, it was a terrible agreement. It led to Hitler specifically, and I think a lot of our members, unfortunately, fell into that. And thirdly, I thought about Rwanda as well, and how it was easy for a certain Adventist to fall right into line to slaughtering Tutsi Adventists. And how what I think happens is that we lose our identity in Christ and we become tribalized. And that we function from that rather than from the high view of what God has brought us out as a people. But I share those insights just simply to reinforce what you were saying too, Doctor. Thank you so much for the presentation. I appreciate it. Thank you for letting me share.
No, thank you very much. I appreciate you bringing out those insights. I was also I had anticipated or thought about putting in some commentary about Rwanda as well, but I was like, that's a whole nother presentation about how that happened and all. I was like, I'm going to go way over the hour if I start going into what happened there as well. But I really do appreciate you bringing out some of those other examples and what you said at the end, the idea of us losing our identity in Christ and kind of that worldview of us all being Christians or people of God, creations of God, brothers and sisters in God, regardless of whether or not they are necessarily in Christ as Christians. We are still children of God in terms of we are all God's creation, and we have to care about each other. And that idea of pitting us against one another in the narrow view certainly is one of those things that contributes to us falling into these battles with one another in real ways and excusing any types of injustices and human rights abuses against different groups. So thank you.
Well pointed. Thank you. Ian Hartley, I'd ask you to contribute. Lauren, I'm going to put you up next if you can unmute. I'm having no success in getting you to unmute off your phone. But Ian, tell us, where are things in your head with this fine presentation?
So, a great presentation. I grew up in South Africa at the heyday of apartheid. This is what's so tragic about myself, is that I was a Seventh-day Adventist missionary in Uganda just before Idi Amin came to power. In my culture, I saw nothing wrong with apartheid. It was brought to my consciousness by playing tennis with some British agriculturalists, which were near the mission station. And they really gave me a hard time over apartheid. And that was the first time that I actually began to think about the morality of it. Now, I'm a product of Adventist high schools and an Adventist college. no one ever raised the question of the morality of apartheid in my Adventist education. Then there was Rwanda, an adjacent country. The only hero against the genocide amongst Adventism that I know of is Carl Wilkins, who was an ADRA leader in Rwanda. Adventists, Tutsis, Hutus just joined in the melee of the genocide. And some of the Adventist pastors were indicted for their part in it. When it comes to the Balkans, we had Adventist Serbians, Adventist Croats. Like, what's bothering me is that we seem to have no systemic antipathy towards this kind of what I would call, and I think you mentioned it, is that we're more concerned with Adventist rights than human rights. In the US, you have black conferences and white conferences. Nobody deals with it. Look, in apartheid South Africa, this is the tragedy of it, is that the General Conference split the Adventist Church in South Africa into a black union and a white union. Now, of course, the black members were opposed to that, and rightly so. But I only know of one white South African leader who was a division officer who opposed it, but he was quickly dealt with. We imagine ourselves to be heroes when it comes to defending the Sabbath, as you pointed out. But when it comes to basic human rights, we have a very bad track record. And I don't know when we're going to deal with it, but we do need to deal with it. And Jesus' great prayer in John 17 is for unity. And yet in Adventism, as soon as you have enough people, you split off into an ethnic congregation. And there goes the unity. It's a theoretical concept, but we don't practice it at any significant level in reality. And I'm happy to be corrected if I'm wrong, because it really bothers me. That Jesus' primary prayer is not taken in any practical way. Thank you so much for letting me share my beef.
No, thank you.
That's so right on point. Tremendous.
And I was very curious. I tried to find a lot. I didn't find a lot on the apartheid situation, and I did wonder, were there any Adventists who spoke up in our leadership that spoke up during apartheid? So thank you for sharing some of your personal recollections of what happened during that time.
Perfect. Lauren, welcome. It's good to see your face.
Hey, I apologize to all of you. Can you hear me okay, Gerald?
Perfect.
All right. I apologize that I haven't been on the whole time. I stayed on until my computer went dead, and then I figured out how to get on with my phone. So, Dr. Ray, I wish I could have heard it all. So some of the things I'm going to ask may have already been spoken of. The first thing is I want to make a reference to the subject of Hitler that some of you have talked about. There was an amazing book review in March in the New Yorker called The Forgotten History of Hitler's Establishment Enablers. It says the Nazi leader didn't seize power, he was given it. Yeah. Timothy Ryback wrote a book on this. It's called Hitler's Final Rise to Power. And this ought to be scary because people knew that people thought that he was wiser. People thought he was a buffoon, thought Hitler was a fool, thought he was easily controlled. Whole groups of people thought they could use him or supplant him in order to get their thing done. And in the end, he pulled out every stop in order to take absolute power and become the Führer. And I'll just leave you to consider how that could be applied to our current situation and do with it what you will. But I suggest that you look at the piece if you can get it. It's March 18th, 2024 by Adam Gopnik, Gopnik, The Forgotten History of Hitler's Establishment Enablers. But the other thing I was going to say, Courtney, we talk about, we always talk about, everybody agrees, no, we should not be straightforwardly, we should not discriminate against gay people, we should not be prejudiced against people of other nations and cultures. And, everybody's going to agree with that. When we talk about it in those very straightforward terms, we're all going to agree. I've never met a person, even in spite of some of the really cruel things they've said, who said I'm a racist. In fact, they say I'm not a racist. I'm not a racist, but and then it goes on from there. Some of my best friends are Black. The fact is that nobody just kind of plasters. Well, few. There are some that do. White nationalists sort of the people, perhaps, but most of us don't just plaster our divisions with other people right out into the open. We don't wear them on our T-shirts. We don't walk around saying, "Oh, those damn Black people." We don't say things like that. Everything kind of sneaks up on us. Our prejudices are a little bit hidden. We don't know quite how to identify them. We have nuanced them within ourselves so effectively that we don't know quite how to be, quite how to evaluate others equitably. And so, in fact, we don't treat our Black acquaintances as friends in the same way we do with the ones that are the people who are somewhat more like us. We're all very sneaky about our prejudices, and so sneaky that we don't even recognize them ourselves. And so the quest, Courtney, would seem to be to help us. It's almost like those pictures where you look at the picture and if you see the number, you're colorblind, or you're not colorblind. It's something like that. We really don't understand what's behind what's causing us to look at somebody else that way. And so I guess I just want to say that is one sort of deeper level of the problem. Does that make sense, Courtney?
No, I absolutely hear what you're saying about the fact that bias is insidious and we don't recognize it. And a lot of times it's blind, implicit bias that we don't recognize. And even if it's pointed out, we don't want to recognize it. We like to deny it, even in the face of all the evidence that says that this is what your actions are doing, and this is what it leads to. So you should recognize how your actions are impacting people, even if you say that you're not discriminatory towards those people. But it's very difficult. You have to be willing to be introspective and be willing to actually look at what are those ways in which I am biased. And also, speaking just from a faith perspective, a lot of times we are taught that some of these biases are of God. And so
Yes.
if we recognize them, we justify them because that's what God tells us that we're supposed to believe. And for a long time, racism was justified because people said that, oh, you shouldn't be unequally yoked. And that's exactly what it is when you have people of different races mixing together. And there were lots of different things that justify slavery, lots of different things still today to justify the subjugation of women, lots of things that are still used to justify the killing and persecution of people in the queer community, lots of things used to justify people who are mentally disabled, who have different issues emotionally, have all these different aspects of life that divide people into groups that we say that there's a reason why, justifiably from the Bible, why we should do this thing against this group of people. And we think that it gives us license to do that. Even when I think it was it Ian who was talking about the conferences here in the United States, the Black conferences and the state conferences, so the regional conferences and the state conferences. Those kinds of divisions came about because the Adventist Church itself was still propagating that type of segregation and racism. And if you guys know the history of the regional conferences, how it got started was there was a Black woman who was very fair-skinned who went to a hospital, which is now WAU, and she was at first admitted and they found out that she was actually Black. So then they sent her across to the colored hospital, and by the time she got there, she had died. And so the Black congregants were just kind of like, you know what, we're not going to be continually just relegated to second class to that point. And so there became this division, and there are still things that have not been worked out and lots of things that have not been addressed because, like you said, Lauren, there's this idea that we don't want to admit to ourselves if there are biases, and there are systemic things that need to be worked out in our church before there can be any true unity. And even when we talk about things like women's ordination, I know that there was a comment earlier about the influence, and we talked a little bit about, I don't know if you were on, the influence of the North American division or the United States on the rest of the world church. And there's one aspect where we're not really very influential, and that is just the treatment of women. We have these ideas that the subjugation of women is part of biblical hierarchy, and the family unit is structured in such a way that women are, subjected to the men in their lives, and we are indoctrinated in many times of these things that reinforce our prejudices and justify them to each other, so that we're able to say, well, yes, I might feel that way, but the Bible tells me that I should feel that way. And so it gives us a reason not to change. And so we can hold on to it and still feel okay because, hey, I'm just doing what the Bible says. I'm not that way, but I just have to do what the Word of God tells me to do. And so even if that means that, it might sound a little racist, or it sounds a little sexist, or it sounds a little, whatever discriminatory thing that we have, I can justify it by Scripture and justify it by my...
I don't think most people do that with race anymore, but they certainly do it with homosexuality all the time. Okay, see. I'll finish up with just one anecdote that I remember from a few years ago. I was at a meeting, and Les Pollard was preaching, and Les said, white people keep coming up to me and saying, why do we have separate black and white conferences? It's not right. We should all have just one conference. And he said, I just turn to them and say, our conference would be happy to bring all of your white churches into our conference, under our conference office. And he said, that always shuts them up, because that's not what they were hoping to see happen.
Absolutely.
Good anecdote. Lynn Boyd You're up. George, I was trying to get you to unmute and you were a little slow on it, so I'll have you after Lynn. Lynn Boyd? I'm not hearing you. Turn on your microphone on the top of your computer. Make sure it's not muted. Not hearing you.
Oh, now you have to unmute him again.
Let's try it one more time.
It's saying the host.
Oh, there
you.
you go. We can hear you now.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes,
It's
sir.
telling me the host did not let me unmute. So, okay. First of all, since we're a community here, I hope for all of you who are in the College Place area, I've been eating Concord grapes. We have so many of them. If you want some, come over and get some. I'm right beside Andy's Market in the back part of the market, 1022 Broadway. That's what I've been eating while we talked. Secondly, it was a pleasure to listen to Ian. I had the pleasure of serving with him in South Africa for a while, and he and I rode. We were assigned to go to he only talked about the black and white division, but there was a colored division as well, and that distinction was important in South Africa. I think it still is. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Please continue.
So we had in the same geographical area where we were serving 3 different conferences that, they had churches in the same, sometimes just blocks from each other, and we never really talked to each other. We never did anything together. But when the GC stepped in and tried to integrate things, because we were in that area at that time directly under the GC, they said, listen, you have to integrate somehow. We were assigned, because I was in a union office, a union position. I wasn't in the office. I was working for the union as a lecturer in a college. We were assigned to go to the camp meeting of the colored camp meeting, which I noticed none of the other lecturers were assigned to do that. Maybe I was assigned because I was not a South African. I don't know. But Ian was there as a speaker, and we both remember, I think, that the guest speaker that was invited, I don't know if it was invited by the colored conference or if it was sent by the GC, was Black American, African American, and he advised the people not to listen to the general conference. It was very interesting from the pulpit. He said, "Don't listen to those guys. They've been trying. You need to do what you need to do." And at the time, I was wondering where he was trying to go with this. I think he was making the case for keeping the conference separate. That's what I think he was making the case for.
Oh.
But it strikes in the end. Well, I'll talk a little bit about what actually happened. In the end, as I listen to this conversation, it seems to me it's a mistake to look to a corporate structure for our ethic. And I've come to make a firm distinction between my personal community, my personal community church, and the organizational church. The organizational church has its place, and we have to have organization. We've been able to do things as an organization that would have been impossible as in just distinct churches. And I do not want to downgrade the importance of the organization, but I don't think the organization has the rightful place of making the decisions. And our church structure, we have still a little bit of that, but it goes against the Reform principle of the priesthood of the believer, I think. Sort of. I mean, we might want to think about that, where the believers decide for themselves how they must act. We still have that strongly, at least in America. It's not so strong in African cultures, where the community is very you don't go against the community, at least in most of the small communities where I was working. So the priesthood of the believer has to come into this discussion somewhere. Now, as I will finish up with just what happened during my tenure in South Africa. There were several conference sessions where we tried to integrate the conferences, and there was a problem. The colored and the black conferences did integrate, and the white conference was supposed to integrate, but we could not get the supermajority. I think we fell short by 1 or 2 votes at the time at the session, and I think they've finally done that. I'm not sure how that happened, but the damage is still there. We are still living with the fallout, and that was, I don't know how many years ago, Ian, must have been 15, 20 years ago. Still, it's still a problem. And I've been out of touch, frankly, with on the ground with the African Seventh-day Adventist Church, the South African. I've been mostly up north of that, but it is still a sore spot. And I could go on with stories, but I just wanted to comment. I appreciate what Ian said, and he's the one to say it. He was there his whole life.
Absolutely, very poignant.
Thank you for that. And I definitely do believe that there is a part of the individual. We as a church are individuals. So even if the church itself doesn't move in a direction of social justice, that doesn't mean that we as individuals can't. But I still think that there's a place to hold accountable the people who are supposedly the leaders of our denomination to also represent our denomination in a way that reflects the ideals of Christ and humanitarian justice. So
well spoken. Thank you. George, you're back on.
Yes, and thank you for allowing me a second. I didn't unmute myself at that time because I always wait until the last few seconds before I do it, and okay. Just a quick thing. It's about the concept of freedom. America has been ingrained in freedom for so long, over 200 years and all that. So for Americans take freedom for granted. And maybe it's difficult for Americans to understand that even though they were never invaded, never bombarded here, and they could enjoy democracy and freedom, they probably feel that freedom is untouchable, and the Constitution will never be touched by anybody. But that's a big mistake at this time. I will finish with planting a little video in everyone's mind. Let's say that in front of your home one day at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, someone would come with a gun and we start yelling at your home saying, at midnight, I will get in your home and I will kill everyone there. And you will just say, nobody ever did it to me, so you don't pay attention to that, right? And at 5 minutes before midnight, would you go and open the door? The guy is still there, pressing you, and you open the door and say, welcome, get in my home, please. Would you do that? You must be really, really mentally, you need Courtney services and mine too, No, you wouldn't do this. You'll be calling the police right away on that. This is happening right now. Someone is yelling at your home saying, I will take your freedom. I will destroy everything that you have in terms of freedom. I can put you in jail if you don't just support me and all that. And there are so many people there, half of the country, opening the door of the White House saying, please come and do it to us. An emotional word picture has been planted in every brain in this session now. Remember that. Are you going to open the door before midnight? Really? Seriously? You must be nuts.
Great analogy. Gerald, you muted yourself.
I can keep going.
I muted
I can
myself.
go for another hour if you want.
I had to discipline my cat, so I muted myself, and I'm sorry. I forgot to come back. Arthur, you've been patient.
In my salad days, regarding racism, in my salad days, I dated a couple of African American women, and they taught me a lot. Now, as transition is no longer creeping up on me, but walking up full speed, I'm living in Albuquerque for 3.5 years. And looking at the Native American community, I've had to realize that I can no longer say the words, "I'm not a racist." I can, however, say these words: I am a racist, an old white guy racist, and I fight against it every moment of every day. Chaplain Lynn and a doctor from India and a Navajo shaman are putting together an outline for a book and how to integrate indigenous religion, indigenous spirituality, and Father Richard Rohr has been very helpful in my journey too on that matter. But they're putting together this book to find a way that they can spread across hospitals how to integrate Native American culture or indigenous culture, spirituality into our white organized corporate structures that St. Paul refers to as the principalities of the air, or the powers of the air and the principalities, much like the organization most of us grew up in. And realizing that variance from my salad days, and those African American girls taught me a lot. The Reverend Lynn has taught me a lot. I'm more open now to universalism than I ever have been in the past. I grew up thinking that in Boulder Junior Academy, Broadview Academy, Andrews University, I grew up thinking that there was the right and the wrong. I'm not sure that's the way God thinks about it. I grew up thinking there was up and down, gay and straight, good and bad. And I'm just not sure about that anymore.
Good for you.
I think that, as the Bible says, we see it now through glass darkly, but then face to face. There's going to be so many things that we thought and believed were one way, and we will be surprised that God will tell us, actually, that's something totally different.
That could be a conversation for another day. Phone number 845. Tell us who you are and contribute. You've been patiently on board here. What have you got to say?
This is Eduardo. I'm using my iPhone.
Yeah.
Maybe my iPad. In regards to the General Conference Authority, the decision that the General Conference is the voice of God was given, I think, in the early 60s.
We're missing about half of what you're saying. Perhaps if you got closer to your phone, I'm not sure.
In regard to the authority of the General Conference, in the early 1860s, or just after the organization became the church became an organization, they decided that the General Conference was the post of God. And later on, Sister White wrote, there's no longer that case. General Conference is no longer the voice of God. But the problem was that nobody catches that the General Conference was the General Conference Committee. The first General Conference was made out of 3 leaders, and they were the voice of. But later on, Sister White said no longer. After she said no longer, he came back and said the General Conference session is the voice of God. And I think that the church leaders go by this expression that the General Conference session is the decider. What do you think about that?
I think that, as you said, there was a progression throughout the years of Ellen White's position on that. The General Conference in session, as she was talking about when they got together for the quinquenniums, I think that perhaps if she was still alive today, she might have something else to say, because our church structure has continued to evolve and continue to change, and it definitely doesn't look like it did in the late 1800s, and it doesn't even look like it looked in the late 1900s now. And so I think that we can't be static in our understanding of what the church is, because the church has not been static itself. And we have changed and evolved in lots of different ways. And I think that the church continues to look for the best way to interpret how God is leading. And we have to be open to hearing that and not be consumed with the fact or belief that one person, one committee, or one organization is instead the voice of God, because I don't know if that would be something that would be a true reflection of where we are today.